The city is already awake. Before you've opened your eyes on this particular August morning, before the first conscious thought is formed, Pompeii has been running for 2 hours. Somewhere near the Stabian Gate, a baker named Modestus is pulling bread from an oven that has been burning since the 3rd hour of night. The loaves are round and scored in 8 sections, pre-divided for sharing, and the smell of them, wheat and smoke and the faint char of the stone oven, is threading out into the street with the gray pre-dawn light. Somewhere on the Via dell'Abbondanza, a woman named Aselina is unlocking the shutters of her thermopolium. The counter is carved from volcanic stone. Set into it, like jewels in a ring, are wide clay jars still holding the warmth of yesterday. Lentil stew, crushed fava beans, and wine from Vesuvius's own slopes. She has done this every morning for years. The pattern of it lives in her hands the way language lives in a throat. She does not think about it. She just opens. On a wall 3 streets over, someone has scratched these words into the plaster. I admire you, wall, for not having collapsed at having to carry the tedious scribblings of so many writers. It was probably written yesterday, or last week. Someone passed, found a nail, found a thought too good to keep to themselves. Among the 11,000 pieces of graffiti that survive in this city, this one has a particular quality, self-aware, dry, slightly bored, that makes the writer feel close enough to touch. This is Pompeii. Population somewhere between 10 and 20,000, depending on the season and who you ask. A port city on the Bay of Naples, riding on fertile volcanic soil that produces wine so good they've been exporting it to Rome for a century. A city with 158 food and drink establishments, 33 bakeries, 4 public bathhouses, an amphitheater that holds 20,000 people, and a class of citizens so accustomed to minor earthquakes that they have largely stopped flinching when the ground shakes. It is the summer of 79 AD. The city has 17 centuries of obscurity ahead of it and does not know this. What it knows is bread and wine and the particular pleasure of the baths in the afternoon heat. What it knows is the election cycle, the gladiator fights, the gossip written in charcoal on every available surface. What it knows is the mountain, visible from nearly every street, green to its slopes, its fertile terraced vineyards descending toward the city like a gift, a mountain that its residents call by a name that has no Latin equivalent for what it actually is, because the Latin language has no word for volcano. They have never needed one before. Stay with me. We are going inside. The darkness is still thick when the first oven opens. You would not call it morning yet. The sky above the Bay of Naples holds a particular quality of pre-dawn. Not black, not gray, but something between the two, the kind of color that has no name because most people are asleep when it happens. The stars over Vesuvius are still visible. The mountain is a silhouette against them, its outline enormous and unhurried, and its terraced vineyards invisible in the dark but present. You know they are there the way you know a neighbor's house is there when you cannot see it. The mountain has always been there. It will always be there. Somewhere near the Stabian Gate, in a low-ceilinged room that smells of wheat flour and wood smoke and the faint mineral bitterness of the stone itself, a man is loading bread into an oven. He works by lamplight. The lamp is small, a clay dish barely the size of a palm. Olive oil burning at a wick of twisted flax, throwing a circle of amber that barely reaches the walls. He does not need to see clearly. His hands know this work. They have known it for years. The motion of loading the long wooden paddle, angling it into the oven's mouth. You're releasing the round loaves onto the hot stone floor. He does not think about it. He just does it in the dark before the city has remembered to wake up. His name, or something close to it, may have been Modestus. We know this because archaeologists found his name stamped into the base of bread loaves, a baker's mark, a signature of commerce pressed into dough before baking. When the eruption came, 81 of his loaves were still in the oven, still there when excavators found them nearly 17 centuries later. Round, carbonized, their surfaces cracked by time, but their shape intact, each one scored in 8 sections, pre-divided, ready for sharing, because in Pompeii, bread was not a private thing. It was the city's daily agreement with itself. We will eat. We will open. We will begin again. Those 81 loaves are still in the Naples Archaeological Museum. If you go, you can see the score marks. In Pompeii, morning belongs to the people who serve the rest of the city before the rest of the city is awake. The Romans measured their day in 12 hours of daylight, each hour expanding or contracting with the season like something alive. In August in Campania, the first hour, hora prima, begins just before 5 in the morning, when the eastern sky above the mountains starts to pale. But the bakers, the fullers, the porters, the water carriers, they are moving well before that. The city that appears to everyone else as a stage already set, counter already wiped, bread already warm, is actually a city that has been quietly preparing for hours. The performance of daily life in Pompeii rests on a deep foundation of invisible work done in the dark, by people whose names appear in no official record and on few walls. Only the bread survives to speak for them. Only the bread and the floor where the donkeys walk their endless circles and the chain marks worn into the stone. Let that land slowly. Dawn comes the way it always comes in the Mediterranean, not gradually but suddenly, a decision the sky makes and then commits to. The amber that was only touching the tops of the highest buildings spreads downward. The painted stucco walls of the Via dell'Abbondanza, red, yellow, terracotta, a particular shade of Pompeian green that no modern paint has quite replicated, begin to hold the light. The street is narrow enough that the buildings lean toward each other overhead, then close enough at the upper floors that neighbors across the gap could exchange a loaf of bread without leaning far. Below, the stepping stones crossing the road catch the morning light along their worn edges, raised blocks of volcanic stone, smoothed by 1,000 footsteps, placed exactly where they are, so that by afternoon, when the road runs with animal water and market effluent and the constant biological byproduct of a city of 20,000 people living at close quarters, a person can still cross without ruining their sandals. The city is designed for its own reality. That's what you notice first, once your eyes adjust. The first task of nearly every Pompeian morning is water. Most homes in this city have no running water. What the city has is an aqueduct. The Aqua Augusta, fed by springs in the Apennines, it carried across the landscape on stone arches, entering Pompeii through a water tower near the Vesuvian gate that distributes its pressure through a network of lead pipes to fountains spaced at intervals throughout the streets. There are over 25 of these public fountains. Each one is a carved stone basin, continuously fed, perpetually overflowing in a thin sheet down into the street drains below. The sound of it steady and small and constant, the way a heartbeat is constant. You stop noticing it until it stops. Every morning, before any other task, the women and slaves and servants of Pompeii make their fountain walk. A clay amphora balanced on a hip or a shoulder, the particular gait of someone carrying weight without thinking about the weight. The fountain nearest the Stabian baths shows on its carved stone basin signs of the daily impact, a groove worn into the lip where generations of clay jars were set down, lifted, set down again. Not a mark anyone made deliberately, a mark that accumulated year by year, from the sheer repetition of ordinary life. The fountain is also, by necessity, the first social space of the morning. You cannot live in Pompeii and avoid other people at the water. The city is too small for avoidance. It is a city where everyone is someone's neighbor's former employer's cousin, where news and gossip travel at the speed of walking, which, in a city, this compact is nearly the speed of thought. Arguments begin at fountains. Agreements are made. A woman named Tertulla is discussed at length at least one fountain, and at least once. We know this because someone found the conversation too good to keep to themselves and scratched it into a nearby wall, which is how Tertulla's name survived 2,000 years. We don't know what she did. We know she was talked about. Somehow, in the specific texture of a Pompeian morning at a stone basin, that feels like enough. Bread and cheese. This is Pompeian breakfast. Sometimes an egg, sometimes an olive still sharp with brine from the jar, sometimes a fig still holding the warmth of yesterday's sun from where it sat on a window ledge. A cup of pasca, the common drink of ordinary Romans, water and vinegar, and a scrape of honey, sharper than it sounds, energizing in the way that acidic things are energizing, cold from the fountain water used to mix it. The wealthy ate the same ingredients and more of them, once on finer pottery, with someone else doing the fetching. The poor ate the same ingredients and fewer of them, standing up on their way somewhere. Breakfast in Pompeii was not a ceremony. It was fuel. The Romans understood the day as having distinct regions: morning for work, afternoon for leisure, evening for dining properly if you were the kind of person who dined properly. And the morning demanded movement, not sitting. You ate what you needed, you moved. But here's the thing that lingers once you start thinking about it. The bread that Modestus pulled from his oven before dawn, the cheese that came from farms on Vesuvius's lower slopes, the olives pressed from trees that had been growing since before the city was Roman. All of it was this morning's version of a meal that had been eaten in this city, in this form, by people like this, for generations. Breakfast in Pompeii in 79 AD would not have looked entirely foreign to someone who had eaten breakfast in Pompeii 100 years earlier. The continuity of it is almost unbearable once you notice it. The same bread, the same olives, the same cup, tipped, drained, set down. By the second hour, the Via dell'Abbondanza begins its daily transformation. The shutters come down. This is the sound of Pompeii waking up in earnest. Not birdsong, not a church bell, but the wooden clatter of taberna shutters sliding back in their stone grooves, each one releasing a rectangle of shadow into the brightening morning, each one opening a room that was sealed and private into something public and operational. The grooves for these shutters are still there. A cut into the thresholds of shops that have been abandoned for nearly 2,000 years, worn by the daily repetition of opening and closing into smooth channels deep enough to catch a finger. Some of these grooves are worn to a depth that implies decades of use, not just years, decades, of the same shutter, the same groove, the same morning gesture of opening. Stand in one of these doorways long enough, and the gesture becomes almost imaginable. The weight of the shutter, the slight resistance of a groove that needs cleaning, the sound of the street coming in. The taberna was the basic commercial unit of Pompeii's economy. A single room, open at the front, its proprietor visible inside, arranging goods or calling to passers-by from behind a stone counter. In many of them, a narrow staircase at the back led to a low mezzanine sleeping space above. The proprietor lived inside their own shop, sleeping above their inventory, waking each morning surrounded by the tools and goods of their livelihood. This is not poverty, particularly. It is simply the Roman compression of life and work into a single space, the way a fisherman might sleep in the same room as his nets. The separation of work and home is a modern luxury. In Pompeii, for most people, they were the same place. What was sold? Everything. Pottery, metalwork, garum, The fermented fish sauce that functioned as the universal condiment of the Roman world, used the way we use salt today, made in large ceramic vessels from layers of fish and salt left to liquefy in the sun, smelling in production of something approaching biological catastrophe. It tasting in the finished product of something dense and oceanic and deeply savory. The Romans put garum on almost everything. They exported it. Pompeii had its own garum industry, its own signature recipes, its own competing producers whose names appear on amphora stoppers found as far away as Roman Britain and the Rhine frontier. The fish sauce, made in this city, in low ceramic vats set in courtyards that must have been aggressive neighbors to have on a warm August afternoon, reached the tables of soldiers and merchants and minor officials across an empire of 60 million people. Alongside the garum, wine, bread, cloth, oil, metalwork, jewelry of varying quality, shoes, olive oil in varying grades for varying purposes, fresh produce from the farms on Vesuvius's slopes, yes, and the thousand small necessities of a city that imported what it could not grow and grew almost everything else. The Via dell'Abbondanza, its name means, roughly, the Street of Abundance, was named by later archaeologists for its evident commercial density, not by the Romans who walked it. But the name fits. It was a street where you could meet almost any material need within a 5-minute walk. It was also a street where you would encounter, within that same 5 minutes, at least one piece of unsolicited political advertising, 2 or 3 election endorsements painted in large red letters on freshly whitewashed walls, and the particular noise of a city that has no concept of interior quiet. The children go to school at dawn. If their family can afford it, and many in Pompeii can, because this is a prosperous city, as in a city with a merchant class and a freed slave class, and an artisan class and a property-owning class of sufficient size to support an educational infrastructure. A child of Pompeii reports to the literator, the basic teacher, in the first hour of morning. Schools are not purpose-built buildings. They are corners of colonnades, shaded spots in the forum, sometimes a room lent by a patron or rented cheaply at the back of a shop. The equipment is a wax tablet and a stylus. The lesson is letters, then numbers, then both together. The teacher sits on a raised seat. The students sit on low stools or on the ground, close enough to the street that the morning's commerce is part of the ambient sound of their education. A passage in the graffiti at Pompeii, scratched by what appears to be a student's hand, records a simple addition. Numbers totaled and checked, the work of a child learning that arithmetic is real and useful and has right answers. It is the most ordinary thing imaginable. It is also 2,000 years old, pressed into a wall by a hand that was small and young and still learning how the world worked. That child does not know what month it is. Not really. They know it is summer and hot, and that the mountain is green, and that the bread at the counter near the school costs a certain amount that their mother gave them. They know the fountain nearest their house and the name of the woman who is always there in the mornings. They know the election notices on the wall near the school because they have walked past them every day for weeks, and the letters are large and they are learning to read. They do not know the month's name in the way we know it. They do not know that this summer will not end the way summers end. A morning in Pompeii, then, looks something like this. The bread is out of the oven before the sky has fully committed today. The fountain is moving, always moving, its overflow running in a thin, cold sheet down into the drains. The shutters are coming down along the Via dell'Abbondanza. A fuller, somewhere near the Fuller's Guild, is already treading cloth in a trough of water and aged urine, which is what fullering required and which no one found remarkable enough to complain about, at least not in any record that has survived. A metalsmith is at his brazier. A woman is arranging the jars in the counter of her thermopolium. The lentil stew from yesterday's leftover warmth, the wine in its clay vessel, that's the bread she bought from the baker 2 streets over because her own space is too small for an oven. She does this every morning. She does not think of it as history. She thinks of it as Tuesday. The stepping stones are wet from the night's brief coolness, already beginning to dry in the morning light. The election notice on the wall near the fountain is fresh. The paint applied yesterday by a hired signwriter who does this work all across the city each spring, recommending in confident red letters this magistrate and that edile to the voters who will walk past the wall 100 times before the March elections. The mountain above the city's northern edge is becoming visible now, its green slopes darkening as the sky brightens around it, its summit a clean line against the August blue. The mountain has always been there. That is what the city knows without thinking about it. The way you know a wall is behind you without turning to look. The way you know where you are because you know where everything else is. The bread is warm. The day has begun. Stay with it. We are not done here yet. There is a particular sound that belongs to Pompeii mid-morning. Not one sound, a layering. Cartwheels on basalt stone, a rhythm that starts and starts again, the particular clatter of iron-rimmed wheels finding the joins between paving blocks. Voices, dozens of them, the specific pitch of commerce, not conversation, not argument, but the elevated, slightly performative tone of someone trying to be heard from behind a counter. Somewhere a hammer. Somewhere the hollow wooden thump of an amphora being set down wrong. Beneath all of it, continuous, almost below the threshold of hearing, the fountains. Always the fountains. The city runs on water the way a body runs on blood, and the sound of it never stops. This is what a morning in Pompeii sounds like before you see anything at all. The Via dell'Abbondanza runs approximately 900 meters from the Forum at its western end to the Sarno Gate at its eastern edge. 900 meters. You could walk it in 10 minutes. In practice, on a morning when the city is fully awake, you will not walk it in 10 minutes. You will be stopped, redirected, pulled sideways by a counter you didn't intend to look at, slowed by the crowd narrowing around a cart that has angled badly into the space between two stepping stones and is now the problem of everyone within 30 meters. You will navigate a city that was not designed for efficiency. It was designed for encounter. The difference matters enormously. The street runs through the heart of the ancient city, lined on both sides with significant buildings, shops, and homes whose facades present a continuous surface of stucco and painted plaster, and carved stone counters, and carved stone benches, and painted electoral notices, and religious shrines, and the accumulated visual noise of a city that uses every available surface as a communication medium. The wheel ruts worn into the basalt paving, deep grooves carved by the constant passage of ancient carts, run the length of the street like twin lines of punctuation, marking the path of 10,000 loads of wine and grain and fish sauce and marble and pottery that move through this artery every month. And stand in one of those grooves, and you are standing exactly where the weight of a Roman city moved through the world. 158 thermopolia. That number is worth sitting with. In a city of perhaps 20,000 people, 10 to 20,000, the estimates vary, archaeologists have identified at minimum 158 fast food counters, which means that in almost any direction you walk in Pompeii, within a few minutes of almost any starting point, you will reach a carved stone counter with clay jars sunk into its surface. Some of those jars still hold trace evidence of what was in them when the ash arrived. Lentils, wine, fava beans, spiced sauces, fish stew, warm bread wedged into the gap between two dolia. The city ate standing up in the street from other people's counters. And it was not a degraded version of a proper meal. It was the meal. It was, in fact, a system, an entire urban food infrastructure built from the architectural fact that most homes in Pompeii had no functional kitchen. One famous example is the Thermopolium of Asalina, still displaying painted advertisements and a masonry counter with inset jars used for food storage. On the wall beside her counter, not inside, where only regulars would see it, but outside on the facade where the whole street passes, an election notice bears her name, endorsing a candidate for municipal office. She is not a citizen in the formal Roman sense. She is, almost certainly, a freedwoman. A former slave who bought or earned her freedom, who then built a food business on one of the city's main commercial arteries, who employed a staff of women, Egil, Maria, Nasmarina, their names surviving in the plaster, who put her name on a public wall to tell the Via dell'Abbondanza who she was supporting and, by implication, who she was. In commerce in Pompeii, gender and status lines were crossed in practical, profit-driven ways, reminding us that ancient Rome was more economically flexible than its legal codes suggest. The law said one thing, the street said something more complicated. Now, the walls. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have uncovered more than 11,000 examples of graffiti. 11,000. Written by shopkeepers and soldiers, by children practicing their letters, by men boasting about things that did not happen, by men boasting about things that did. Written in charcoal, scratched with nails, pressed into wet plaster, and painted in red and black by professionals who did this for a living. Written at night by lamplight, written in passing, written in moments of feeling so strong they needed immediate external expression. Written the way water moves, in the direction of least resistance toward any available surface. Early archaeologists were dismissive about the graffiti when it was first discovered because it all seemed so trivial. They wanted monuments. They wanted the official voice of Rome, the inscriptions on temples, the proclamations of emperors, the literary Latin of men who knew they were being preserved. What they found instead were people, specific, irreducible, entirely human people who had opinions about their neighbors and feelings about barmaids and complaints about their hosts and observations about the walls they were writing on. Consider Successus the weaver. He is in love with Iris, a slave girl who works at an inn somewhere on or near the Via dell'Abbondanza. This situation is not going well. Iris, by all available evidence, does not reciprocate. Successus has nonetheless done what lovesick people have always done. He has made his feelings public. He has written on a wall near the inn that he loves Iris, that she does not love him, that he begs her to take pity. This is already a small tragedy compressed into 3 lines of Latin. But then, something happened that turned it into something else entirely. His rival wrote underneath it. The rival retorted, "You love Iris, but she does not love you." Which is not new information. Successus had already established this. But the rival seems to have found the public repetition of this fact to be a satisfying act of cruelty. Successus responded. His rival responded to the response. The wall near the inn of the barmaid Iris became, for a period of days or weeks, a running argument between 2 men competing for the attention of a woman who, by all textual evidence, wanted nothing to do with either of them. 2,000 years later, the whole exchange survives. Journalist Tom Standage, who wrote about ancient graffiti, noted that these were examples of public discussions, literally writing on a friend's wall. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is structural. A public medium, a post, a reply to the reply. Mockery visible to everyone who passes. In escalation. The only difference is the substrate. There is a wall somewhere in the city. The exact location has been noted, catalogued, assigned a number in the great Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum that bears this inscription. O walls, you have held up so much tedious graffiti that I am amazed you have not already collapsed in ruin. This phrase seems to have been a popular one. Slightly different versions of it appear in multiple locations throughout Pompeii's ruins, which means the joke spread. Someone wrote it on one wall, someone else found it funny enough to copy, and it migrated through the city the way good jokes have always migrated, person to person, wall to wall, until it becomes ambient. The joke is self-aware about the medium it uses. It exists inside the thing it's commenting on. It has, and in the vocabulary of a later century, a quality of irony that we associate with a particular kind of urban wit. The wit of someone who is surrounded by human noise and has decided, rather than despair at it, to make the noise slightly funnier. Whoever wrote it knew their city. They had walked these streets long enough to find the density of expression mildly exhausting, and they responded to that exhaustion the way a certain kind of person always responds. By adding to it, in exactly the tone they were gently mocking, we would recognize this person immediately. We would not be surprised to find them insufferable at parties and excellent online. The graffiti covers everything in every register. There are love declarations of genuine feeling, tender and direct. Secundus says hello to his prima, wherever she is. That wherever she is, 5 words that open an entire story without meaning to. Is she traveling, enslaved and moved, dead? The writer doesn't explain. The writer just needed the hello to exist somewhere, in some form, addressed to someone who might never receive it. There are insults so specific they imply entire social histories. Ampliatus Pedania is a thief. Someone needed Pompeii to know this. Someone stood in a street with a piece of charcoal and decided that Ampliatus Pedania's reputation was a public matter. There are endorsements with a particular quality of honesty. I ask that you elect Marcus Cyrenius Vadia to public office. All the late drinkers support him. This is either an enemy trying to ruin Vadia's campaign or a friend so drunk on his own sincerity that he failed to calculate the optics. The ambiguity is perfect. There are lost property notices, a copper pot stolen from a shop, a reward of 65 bronze coins offered for its return, 20 more for the name of the thief. There is a child's drawing of a horse scratched into the plaster of a house with the small, imprecise lines of hands still learning how to render the world. There is a sum of credit for the purchase of bread written on a wall the way you might jot a figure in a notebook. The wall is ledger, the plaster is paper, the city as filing system. And there is this, found in the peristyle garden of a private home, written in a hand careful enough to suggest someone who paused before beginning. Lovers are like bees. They live a honeyed life. It is a small poem. It is not original. Variations of it existed across the Roman world. The person who wrote it on this particular wall, in this particular garden, was not trying to claim authorship. They were trying to make a space more beautiful. They had a thought about love and bees and sweetness, and they pressed it into the wall of their garden as a kind of permanent decoration. They wanted to live somewhere with that sentence in it. The political notices are their own category entirely. The signs of several bars and electoral inscriptions are still visible on the facade of Ussalina's Thermopolium and on nearly every other street-facing surface in the city that was whitewashed in time for the spring campaign. Pompeii held annual elections for its magistrates, the duoviri who governed, the aediles who supervised markets and public buildings. And each election cycle, the city was canvassed from end to end with fresh endorsements painted by professional sign writers called scriptores. Writing election slogans was the job of sign writers who worked alongside lantern bearers, because slogan writing was a night task. The city slept, and the sign writers moved through it with their pots of red and black paint, lettering the facades of homes and shops and temples with endorsements from guilds and neighbor groups and professional associations. The fruit sellers support this man. The bakers support that one. The goldsmiths have formally aligned with a candidate. The late drinkers support Vatia. The petty thieves, in a piece of graffiti of almost surreal political audacity, also support Vatia, and which is either a coordinated attempt at sabotage by his enemies or the most honest political endorsement ever recorded in the ancient world. What strikes a modern reader looking at this system is not its primitiveness, it is its density. Political participation in Pompeii was not abstract or occasional. It was written on the wall outside your breakfast counter. It was visible every morning when you walked to the fountain. It was part of the landscape of the city in the most literal sense, painted onto the surfaces you navigated daily, layering over last year's endorsements the way sediment layers over sediment, each stratum a year of civic life. Archaeologists can sometimes sequence Pompeian political history by reading the paint layers on a single wall. Beneath this year's red letters, last year's red letters. Beneath those, the year before. Each one a city deciding or trying to decide who it wanted to be. Move off the Via dell'Abbondanza and the city folds into itself. The side streets are narrower, often barely 2 meters across, the buildings pressing together overhead. They have their own character, their own sounds. A fuller's workshop releases the particular smell of the trade, wet wool and aged urine and wood smoke, into an alleyway that a stone's throw from the main street becomes suddenly quiet, suddenly particular. Suddenly the kind of small street that belongs to the people who live on it rather than to the city at large. A metalsmith shop with tools visible through an open doorway. A private home with a mosaic threshold, a geometric pattern, black and white, worn smooth at its center by years of feet crossing it. A garden wall over which a fig tree extends its branches into the public space, which in a city this dense is a kind of generosity, a small botanical gift to whoever passes. The streets of Pompeii were economic arteries. Merchants extended their shops onto the sidewalks, selling everything from bread and olives to fabrics and tools. Food vendors called out to passers-by, offering warm meals, wine, or a place to rest. The mingling of commerce and conversation was a constant. This is the thing that the archaeological record makes undeniable about Pompeii. The city was not divided into public and private in the way a modern city is divided. There was no clean line where commerce ended and life began, where the street stopped and the home started. The taberna proprietor slept above his inventory. Yet the woman at the thermopolium counter was simultaneously working, socializing, and participating in civic life. The walls were both structural surfaces and public forums. The street was the living room of a city that had not yet invented the concept of a room purely for living. You had to be present in the street to exist in this city. There was no other option. And being present in the street meant being audible, visible, arguable, endorsable, insultable. It meant your name might end up on a wall. It meant Tertulla's name ended up on a wall. It meant that whatever you did, whatever you felt, whatever dispute you were conducting with your neighbor or the man who sold you that amphora of watered wine, Pompeii knew about it. Pompeii commented. Pompeii scratched it into the plaster and left it there for whoever came next. As the city has no sense of its own temporariness. That is the deepest thing the streets tell you. Not that Pompeii was happy exactly. It was a city, and cities contain the full range of human experience, but that it was thoroughly, without reservation, present. The election would be held in March. The bread would be sold by the 3rd hour. The rival would write his response beneath the lovesick weaver's declaration. The copper pot, if the gods cooperated, would be returned for 65 bronze coins. Life had a next step. Life always had a next step. The wheel ruts in the basalt run toward the Sarno gate and keep going. The fountains overflow into the street drains and the water keeps moving. The walls hold their 11,000 voices with something that now looks like patience or grace, or the simple structural stubbornness of stone. O walls, you have held up so much tedious graffiti that I am amazed you have not already collapsed in ruin. They held. The graffiti is still there. Walk the Via dell'Abbondanza on a busy afternoon, and the crowd around you is not the crowd that history usually pictures. Not senators in togas carried by litters, not the abstract, faceless poor shuffling at the margins. Something more tangled and more interesting than either. A city of people whose legal categories said one thing and whose actual lives said something considerably more complicated. A city where the gap between what the law permitted and what commerce rewarded was wide enough to drive a cart through, and many people did. To understand Pompeii, you have to understand that it ran on a tension. And on one side, the rigid architecture of Roman law, which divided human beings into clean categories: slave, freed, freeborn, and assigned rights accordingly. On the other, the actual appetite of a prosperous commercial city for competence, reliability, and profit, which cared considerably less about legal status than about whether you could manage accounts, run a bar, bake bread, and show up before dawn. The tension between those two things, the law's insistence on hierarchy and commerce's indifference to it, is what gave Pompeii its particular social texture. The texture is preserved in its walls, its inscriptions, its architecture, and occasionally in the specific human lives the evidence allows us to partially reconstruct. What you find when you look closely is not a simple pyramid. It is a city full of people working the system, some from the bottom, some from somewhere in the middle, a few from positions so elevated that the system barely touched them, and underneath all of it, beneath every thermopolium counter, every election notice, every beautifully frescoed dining room, a foundational population of enslaved people without whom none of the rest of it functioned. Start there, because not starting there is a kind of dishonesty. At the time of the eruption, slaves and freed slaves were very prominent in Pompeii. Urban social, economic, and political networks were closely informed by servile or ex-servile status. Scholars now estimate that enslaved people made up somewhere between 20 and 45% of Pompeii's total population. Think about that number for a moment. At the lower bound, 1 in 5 people you pass on the Via dell'Abbondanza has no legal personhood. At the upper bound, it is closer to 1 in 2. The city's bread, its wine, its garum, its construction, its financial record-keeping, its domestic labor, all of it sustained by people who could be bought, sold, beaten, and legally owned as property. Evidence from rural villas suggests that life was considerably harder for agricultural slaves than for domestic ones. Slave quarters excavated at a villa at Civita Giuliana just outside Pompeii had plain walls and earth floors, windows that were slits, and equipment stored in the same rooms where enslaved people slept. In the city itself, the range was wider. Highly skilled slaves who worked closely with their masters could become trusted and essential to the business, keeping accounts, entering contracts, representing interests, with better prospects for eventual manumission. And then there were the bakery workers, the ones in the iron-barred rooms, the ones whose feet wore the circular track into the stone floor as they turned the mill hour after hour in the dark. Both things were Pompeii. The skilled secretary who wrote his own sale receipt when his master sold him to the banker Lucius Caecilius, a document that survives, a man recording his own transfer as property in the careful hand of someone who had been trusted with his master's correspondence for years. And the miller in the sealed room, whose name we do not have, whose face we cannot reconstruct, who is present in the archaeological record only as a groove in stone. The city's prosperity was built on top of this entire spectrum. The beautiful frescoed walls were paid for by the work that happened in the unwindowed rooms. This was not incidental. It was structural. Roman ideology preferred not to look directly at this. The law had mechanisms for managing the cognitive dissonance. Slavery was framed as a condition of bad fortune, not of inherent worth. A slave who worked hard and pleased their master might eventually be freed, which meant the system could be presented as a ladder rather than a cage. The latter was real for some. The cage was real for more. Above the enslaved, in law, if not always in practice, stood the freedmen and freedwomen. Manumission, the formal act of freeing a slave, was practiced in Pompeii with enough regularity that the freed class was large, economically significant, and socially complex in its own right. Freedmen encompassed those members of society who were once slaves, but either bought their freedom or were released from their owners. Some members of this class were educated and held jobs such as scribes, while the majority worked as traders, merchants, blacksmiths, and bakers. They could own property, they could vote, they could run businesses, enter contracts, employ others, accumulate wealth. What they could not do, with rare exceptions engineered by extraordinary workarounds, was hold political office. This produced something scholars call status dissonance, a condition where a person's wealth, influence, and practical power in the world significantly outstrips what their legal category permits them to claim formally. Pompeii's freedman class was full of it. The man who employed 20 people, owned 3 properties, and had his name on every commercial document on the street still could not stand for election to the city council. He had more money than the man who could. He voted for the man who could. He funded the building that the man who could put his name on. The whole arrangement was understood by everyone involved and commented on by nobody officially, because the official version of Rome required the pretense that legal status and actual standing corresponded. They did not correspond. Not in Pompeii in 79 AD, not very often. Consider Numerius Popitius Ampliatus. He was a freedman, a former slave who had, by some combination of skill and fortune, and the specific economic opportunity created by Pompeii's long reconstruction after the 62 AD earthquake, accumulated significant wealth. After the earthquake, many wealthy families left Pompeii, disentrusting the management of their damaged assets to their freedmen. The protracted reconstruction paved the way for social climbers and for owners of medium-sized houses who had rapidly accumulated wealth through commerce and business. Ampliatus was one of those people. He read the situation correctly. He moved into the vacuum. But wealth was not enough. Ampliatus could not hold office. His former enslaved status followed him in the law the way a shadow follows a body, always there at every formal threshold, blocking the door. What he could do was what Roman civic culture had always permitted the wealthy to do: spend publicly and let the spending speak. The existing Temple of Isis was rebuilt following its destruction in the earthquake of 62 CE. It was reconstructed in honor of a 6-year-old boy named Numerius Popitius Celsinus by his freedman father, Numerius Popitius Ampliatus. The inscription above the temple entrance, carved in stone and placed where every person entering the sacred precinct would read it, stated that Numerius Popitius Celsinus, son of Numerius, had rebuilt the temple from its foundations at his own expense. Because of his generosity, although he was only 6 years old, the town councilors nominated him into their number free of charge. 6 years old, nominated to the city council because his father paid for a temple. The boy Celsinus had done nothing. He was 6. He was presumably unaware of the full weight of the transaction being performed in his name. What his father had done was purchase. Now, with stone and money and the rebuilding of a sacred structure, the entry his son would need into the class that he himself could never formally join. He invested in the next generation's legitimacy, using the wealth that his own generation had built from nothing. The inscription above the temple entrance calls this generosity. It was also strategy. It was a freedman working the system with the precision of someone who had studied its mechanics from the outside for a very long time. The Temple of Isis stood intact and fully decorated until August 25, 79 AD. It was the only major temple in Pompeii to have been completely rebuilt after the 62 earthquake. rebuilt faster and more thoroughly than the official state temples, because a man with something to prove had funded it personally. Then there were the Vetii. The House of the Vetii is named for its owners, two successful freedmen, Aulus Vettius Conviva and Augustalis, and Aulus Vettius Restitutus. It has been determined by scholars that the House of the Vetii was owned by these two men after finding their names on two bronze seals located in the front hall. Former slaves. Brothers, possibly, or fellow slaves freed by the same household. Their shared name suggests a shared origin in the same master's property. They had, by 79 AD, become wealthy enough to own one of the most elaborately decorated private residences in Pompeii. Walk through the House of the Vetii, and the first thing that strikes you is the frescoes. Not modest decoration, an entire program of mythological painting covering room after room. The 12 surviving narrative panels depicting scenes from Greek mythology rendered in the fourth Pompeian style, with illusionistic architecture and careful perspective, and the kind of commissioned artistic ambition that costs real money and requires knowing exactly what you want. The dining rooms are formal and large. The garden is colonnaded. The whole house announces its owner's wealth with a directness that Roman aristocratic taste would have found slightly uncomfortable. Old money decorated to imply it had always been there. The Vetii decorated to make sure you noticed. The position of Augustalis was often held by former slaves. The name Restitutus was also commonly a slave name. Scholars have debated the relationship of the two men, many believing they were brothers or fellow slaves. And what is beyond debate is what the house says about what money could purchase in Pompeii in 79 AD. It could purchase the visual language of the aristocracy, the mythology, the garden, the columns, the scale. It could not purchase the legal status. The Vetii could not stand for election. Their house was more beautiful than the houses of men who could. They commissioned the art anyway. They filled every wall with it. They were not apologizing for anything. Now, the women. Eumakia was a priestess and a businesswoman and a woolworking magnate and the most significant private patron of public construction in the Forum during the early imperial period. She funded the building that bears her name. The Eumakia building, on the Forum's eastern edge, a two-story colonnaded structure used primarily for the cloth trade, larger than most of the official civic buildings around it. The Fullers' Guild, who used the building and whose industry she dominated, dedicated a statue to her in return. The inscription on the statue base reads, "The Fullers dedicated this to Eumakia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess." She had a building on the Forum. She had a statue in it dedicated by the guild she supplied. She could not vote. This is the particular texture of being a woman in Pompeii's public life, consequential and invisible at the same time, depending on which layer of the city's operation you were looking at. In commerce, present everywhere, sometimes dominant. In formal civic structure, absent by design. The gap between those two realities was wide enough that real women lived entirely inside it, neither fully absent from public life nor formally admitted to it, negotiating the space between legal exclusion and economic necessity with what looks, from 2,000 years away, like considerable pragmatism. Asalina ran her thermopolium on the Via dell'Abbondanza. Her name on the election notice outside her bar was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of public positioning, a woman in an informal role making herself formally visible on the most public surface available to her. Nevolea Teich, a freedwoman, built her own tomb on the road leading to the Herculaneum Gate and had inscribed on it both her name and the names of her own freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves she had freed herself. A woman who had been property had become a property owner who freed other property. The layers of that particular life, compressed into a tomb inscription on a road outside a city that no longer exists, resist any simple summary. Wax tablets from Pompeii tell of Poppaea note, a freedwoman who had slaves of her own. The wealthy fish sauce manufacturer Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, who dominated the garum market in Pompeii, had his business run in significant part by his freed slaves. A freedwoman buying slaves, a freedman employing freedmen. The categories bending under the weight of people who moved through them, around them, across them, in directions the law had not anticipated and did not fully accommodate. What does it mean that this city was so layered? It means that the person standing next to you at the fountain in the morning, the one with the clay jar, the one whose name you do not know, might be a slave completing the first errand of a day that will not end until well after dark. Or a freedwoman who owns the shop 2 streets over and is thinking about this year's election. Or the daughter of a freeborn citizen who has been to school and knows how to read the election notices and has opinions about them. Or a child born into a wealthy household, free from birth, surrounded by the work of people who are not. You cannot tell from the outside. You cannot tell from the clothes always, because Pompeii was prosperous enough that fine fabric was accessible beyond the very top. You cannot tell from the fountain because everyone drinks the same water. Yet you can sometimes tell from the hands, the particular wear of hands that have turned heavy stone for years, the unblemished hands of someone who has never done physical labor in their life. But mostly you cannot tell. This is precisely what made Pompeii uncomfortable to official Roman ideology and fascinating to everyone else. The city was too busy, too prosperous, too economically dynamic to hold still inside its own legal categories. People moved, people worked, people built temples and named them after their 6-year-old sons. People filled their dining rooms with mythology they had commissioned themselves. People put their names on walls outside their bars and endorsed candidates who would run the city without them. The material and epigraphic traces of these lives, often silent and difficult, tell of a city where servile labor sustained prosperity, while children, women, and men internalized and reproduced its hierarchies even as they navigated them. That last phrase carries enormous weight. They internalized and reproduced the hierarchies even as they navigated them. They were not, most of them, revolutionaries. They were people making decisions inside a system they had not designed, using whatever leverage the system allowed to build lives that the system said they should not be able to build. Some of them succeeded spectacularly. The temple their success paid for is still standing. Some of them are known to us only by a groove worn into a stone floor, the blind circular track of a life moving in the only direction it was permitted to move. Both are Pompeii. Both were standing in the same city on the same August morning under the same green mountain. The mountain did not distinguish between them. Around the 8th hour, Pompeii makes a collective decision. Not a formal one, no bell rings, no official signal is given. But somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, when the sun has moved past the vertical and the shadows have begun their slow eastward lean, when the bread has all been sold and the morning's commerce has exhausted itself, the city shifts. The pace of the Via dell'Abbondanza changes quality. The urgency drains out of it. People who were moving with purpose an hour ago are now moving with something closer to intention, which is different, subtler, slower. They are heading somewhere chosen rather than somewhere required. This is the Roman afternoon. And the Roman afternoon was not a diminished version of the morning. It was the point. The morning in Pompeii existed to fund the afternoon. The bread was baked, the accounts were settled, the arguments at the fountain were concluded, the election notices were read and evaluated, all of it preparation for the second half of the day, which the Romans considered not a reward for work, but simply the other dimension of a life properly lived. A civilization that built 4 public bathhouses in a single city of 20,000 people was not treating leisure as an afterthought. It was building it into the architecture. It was insisting in stone and heated water and the elaborate engineering of hypocaust floors that the afternoon mattered. There's a wall inscription somewhere in the ruins of Pompeii, scratched with the particular confidence of a man who has evaluated the options and arrived at a firm conclusion, that reads something like this: "Baths, wine, and love corrupt our bodies. But baths, wine, and love make life worth living." This was not an original observation. Variations of it appear across the Roman world, on walls in Rome, and in bath complexes from Britain to Syria. It circulated the way good sentences circulate, because it said something people recognized as true about their own lives, and recognition is its own kind of pleasure. The person who scratched it onto a Pompeian wall was not reporting a philosophy. They were agreeing with one. They were saying, yes, this is what the afternoon is for. In the Stabian Baths sit at the intersection of two of Pompeii's main streets, positioned with the deliberate centrality of an institution that expects everyone to use it. They are the oldest public baths in the Roman world, built sometime after 125 BC, occupying a prime location where two major thoroughfares cross. By 79 AD, they have been rebuilt, enlarged, modernized, and rebuilt again. The earthquake of 62 AD gave the city a reason to expand them further, and expand they did. The post-earthquake renovation introduced a swimming pool and decorative fountains alongside new shops on the street front, matching the state-of-the-art standards being set by the central baths under construction nearby. Pompeii, damaged and rebuilding, took the opportunity to make its baths better. This is either pragmatic civic investment or a statement of values, possibly both. To enter the Stabian Baths in the 8th hour of an August afternoon is to enter a particular kind of world, one where the architecture itself is doing the work of relaxation for you before you have done anything. The changing room, the apoditerium, has stone benches along the walls and numbered niches above them for clothing and belongings. The niches are shallow. Theft was common enough here to be a running joke in Roman literature. Seneca mentions it, poets mention it, the Graffiti mentions it. You left your sandals in the niche, and you hoped, without great conviction, that they would be there when you returned. This minor civic anxiety, the small daily gamble of the bathhouse changing room, yet connects across 2,000 years with an immediacy that is almost funny. Beyond the changing room, the sequence begins. Patrons moved from the apoditerium into the tepidarium, the warm room, then the caldarium, the hot bath, and finally, the frigidarium, the cold plunge. Each room is an architectural argument for a different temperature, a different quality of silence, a different relationship between the body and the heat. The caldarium, at its peak, was hot enough to make conversation difficult. You sat in the steam and sweated out whatever the morning had deposited in your muscles and your mood. Slaves moved through the room with strigils, the curved metal scrapers used to remove oil and sweat from skin, because in a city where water was expensive and the baths were a daily ritual. But you cleaned yourself not with water primarily, but with oil applied and then scraped away, taking the dirt with it. The resulting residue, a substance the Romans called grime, was collected and sold. Nothing was wasted. Even the byproduct of cleanliness had a market. The cold plunge at the end was a shock that was also, after the caldarium's enveloping heat, a relief. The frigidarium pool in the Stabian Baths was deep enough to swim in. The water was cold enough that your skin contracted immediately on entry, every nerve ending announcing itself at once. After this, you were clean and awake and emptied of the morning in a way that sleep doesn't quite accomplish. You were ready, in the specific Roman sense of the word, for the rest of the day. But the baths were not primarily about the body. In addition to hot, warm, and cold baths, the public baths offered gyms, massage areas, and gardens. Attendance was not limited to body care, but represented a time for recreation, meeting friends, and discussing politics and business. The sequence of rooms was the frame, not the content. What actually happened in the Stabian baths on any given afternoon was the full range of human social interaction conducted at slightly reduced volume because of the heat. Business negotiations begun in the tepidarium and concluded in the changing room. Introductions made between men who had not previously met but had been told by a mutual acquaintance to find each other here. Gossip refined and redistributed. Political opinions aired with the particular freedom that comes from being literally undressed. The bathhouse stripped away the external markers of status. The toga, the rings, is the quality of the cloth, and left people in the same condition, which is to say, in no condition at all. Pompeian society immediately began reconstructing the markers through conversation, through posture, through the particular Roman art of making your vocabulary signal your education, even when your clothing cannot signal your wealth. Seneca, writing from an apartment above a different Roman bathhouse, described the noise with the vivid irritation of a man who had been trying to concentrate for hours, the grunting of men at exercise, the splashing of someone entering the pool, the shouts of the vendor selling drinks in the changing room, the sound of a hand landing hard on someone's back during a massage. He hated it. His description is the most alive account of what a Roman bathhouse actually sounded like at full operation that has survived antiquity. He was trying to write philosophy. What he accidentally wrote was a soundscape. Now, a discovery announced just this year, in January of 2025, that changes how we understand leisure at the very top of Pompeian society. Archaeologists excavating a grand household in Regio 9 uncovered what may be the largest private thermal bath complex ever found in Pompeii. Not a public bathhouse, a private one built inside a single wealthy residence designed to host large gatherings of invited guests. The thermal baths were designed to hold up to 30 people, enabling the owner to host feasts, spend time in leisure, and impress guests. The complex contains 3 principal rooms following the standard sequence: caldarium, tepidarium, frigidarium, along with a changing room decorated with a mosaic floor and painted walls in vivid red. Immediately adjacent, a large banquet hall, painted black and measuring around 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, with an exquisite mosaic floor and elaborate frescoes depicting mythological scenes inspired by the Trojan War. The director of the Pompeii Archaeological Park, Gabriel Zuchtriegel, said everything was designed to stage a show in which the owner was the center of attention. This is the private bath as performance, not hygiene, not even relaxation in the ordinary sense, but a theatrical production in which the host was simultaneously the producer, the lead actor, and the building itself. You were invited. You undressed in the decorated changing room. You moved through the heat sequence with 30 other guests of your approximate social standing. You emerged into the cold room where athletes were painted on the walls and the Trojan War played out in frescoes around the pool. Then you crossed into the banquet hall and ate. Zuchtriegel noted that this arrangement must have lent these spaces a Greek atmosphere, an environment full of culture and erudition as well as relaxation. Greek culture was the prestige language of Roman intellectual life. To build Greek scenes into your bathhouse walls was to tell your guests, without speaking, that you were the kind of person who understood Greece, who had perhaps traveled there, who could discuss Homer while standing waist-deep in cold water. And it was a bath and an argument and a dinner invitation simultaneously. 2 bodies were found in this complex when it was excavated: a woman between 35 and 50, and a young man in his teens or early 20s, both of whom had tried to take shelter in a small room when Vesuvius arrived. The pyroclastic flow came along the street just outside their room and caused a wall to collapse. The man died beneath the fallen wall. The woman was found curled on a bed, the most luxurious private bathhouse in Pompeii. 2 people who did not get out. The mosaic floor still intact in the changing room. That is the thing about Pompeii's leisure spaces. They preserved exactly as they were, mid-use, mid-afternoon, mid-life. The amphitheater is on the eastern edge of the city, far enough from the Forum to have required a deliberate walk, but close enough to draw the whole city regardless. Built sometime after 80 BC, it is the oldest known stone amphitheater in the Roman world. It holds 20,000 people in a city of perhaps 20,000 residents, a 1-to-1 ratio of seats to citizens that makes clear this was not a building for the city's leisure alone. It was a regional institution. People walked from Herculaneum and Nuceria and Nola on game days, filling the roads outside the city with the particular energy of crowds moving toward shared spectacle. The upper tiers were for the poor and for women. The lower tiers were for men of standing. The awnings above, the velarium, stretched on ropes between poles, threw moving shade across the sand as the afternoon light changed. Vendors moved through the crowd. The smell was animal and dust, and the particular human smell of 20,000 people in the heat. The contests ranged from gladiator versus gladiator to fights pitting men against dangerous animals, and spectacles often lasted 2 or 3 days, drawing people from neighboring towns and sometimes becoming just as rowdy as modern sporting events. The gladiators themselves occupied a social position that the Roman world found difficult to articulate cleanly. They were often slaves or condemned criminals, legally at the bottom of every conceivable category. They were also celebrities. Their names were on walls across the city. Their physical descriptions were offered in language that leaves little ambiguity about what kind of admiration was being expressed. One piece of graffiti records that Salatus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh. Whether this was the assessment of his admirers or his own self-promotion pressed into a public wall, the effect is the same. A man who was property, who fought in an arena, who might die for the entertainment of the crowd, was also, on the walls of Pompeii, a name worth writing. The riot of 59 AD lives in the record as one of the most vivid examples of what happened when Pompeian civic passion exceeded Pompeian civic restraint. A fight broke out in the amphitheater between Pompeian fans and the people of nearby Nuceria, and as a result, the amphitheater was closed for 10 years. The punishment landed. Pompey apparently felt the absence of its arena with genuine civic grief. When Nero lifted the ban early, at the request of his wife Poppaea, who had connections to the city, the relief was commemorated. Not the restoration of the stadium's structural integrity. The restoration of the games, the crowd, the particular afternoon pleasure of watching 2 men decide something with their bodies that language could not. A painting found on the wall of a private home, probably painted by someone who had been there, depicts the riot with a kind of graphic specificity that suggests the painter was less interested in the violence than in the accuracy of the seating arrangement and the architecture of the awning poles. It is documentation dressed as commemoration. Pompey was there. Pompey won. Pompey paid for winning with 10 years of silence in its eastern precinct and found the price, perhaps, not entirely unreasonable. The afternoon ends at a counter. Not the morning counter, not the functional transaction of bread and posca before the day's work. This is wine, properly, at one of the Caponi scattered across the city's side streets, where the proprietor has less ambition and more personality than the Thermopolium, where the benches outside have dice boards scratched directly into the stone, where the wine is cheaper and more arguable in quality and consumed in the company of whoever happened to sit down first. The dice boards are real. They survive in the stone benches outside Pompeian taverns, worn into the surface by years of play. The game boards of men who had finished their work and wanted an hour of chance before the evening arrived. The stakes were small. Oh, the arguments about the stakes were apparently not always small. Roman legal texts deal with tavern dice disputes with a weary specificity that implies the disputes were routine. that the line between a friendly game and a serious grievance was a line Pompeian tavern afternoons regularly crossed, wine and chants and the long, low light of a Mediterranean August evening. The mountain visible above the roofline if you looked up, green, enormous, unhurried. The bread for tomorrow already in the flour. The stew at the thermopolium already cooling toward tomorrow's warmth. The election notice on the wall outside the tavern fresh enough that the paint might still be slightly tacky if you pressed your finger to the red lettering, which was probably a thing someone had done this week, just to see. The afternoon is the city at its most itself. Not striving, not performing, just present. Just alive in the specific, unremarkable, deeply human way that alive means when nothing has gone wrong yet and nothing is expected to. The dice rattles on the stone board. The mountain holds its shape against the darkening sky. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything. For now, for this particular afternoon, for this city that does not know how to imagine itself otherwise, is exactly as it should be. Before anything else happens in a Pompeian morning, before the fountain walk, before the bread, before the shutters on the Via dell'Abbondanza slide back in their grooves, the household speaks to its gods, not a grand ceremony. A small fire lit at the niche in the wall. A few pine cones, some dried figs, an egg placed whole over the embers. A moment of pause in a room that smells of smoke and olive oil and the residue of yesterday's cooking. The father of the household, or, in his absence, whoever has taken up the role, stands before the lararium and speaks the words that have been spoken every morning in this house for as long as anyone can remember, and in houses like this one for centuries before that. The words are not spontaneous. They are formula, inherited, worn smooth by repetition, the way the fountain basin is worn smooth by the daily arrival of clay jars. The formula is the point. You say the right words in the right order because the gods, like contracts, require precision. This is the first thing to understand about religious life in Pompeii. It was not something you did on special occasions. It was something you did before breakfast. It was woven into the structure of the day with the same material insistence as the fountain walk and the bread. You could no more skip the morning offering at the lararium than you could skip eating. Both were maintenance. Both kept something alive that would otherwise diminish and eventually fail. The lararium, the household shrine, was the altar of the lares, the deities protecting the household and family. Almost every home in Pompeii has one. Not almost, more than that. The lararium appears in the humble apartment and in the frescoed mansion and in the back room of the taberna and in the baker's workshop. It appears wherever people lived with enough stability to define a space as theirs, which in Pompeii was essentially everywhere. The shrines of domestic gods were found within the kitchen and in public parts of the house. And the size of the shrine depended on the wealth of the family or business. A wealthy household might commission an elaborate painted lararium, a full architectural niche with columns and pediment, the lares depicted as dancing youths in short tunics, a serpent coiling upward beneath them representing the household's animating spirit, the genius, rendered with real artistic ambition by a painter who understood what was being asked of him. A poorer household might have a simple painted rectangle on a whitewashed wall, the figures barely more than outlines, the offering shelf a narrow stone ledge. The intent was identical. Analysis of organic residues in the lararium of a baker's house confirmed that the carbonization of fines, including pine cones, pine nuts, dried figs, whole eggs, grape seeds, as in olive stones, was caused by a ritual fire, not by the eruption itself. Someone lit that fire deliberately in an oxidizing environment as part of a structured ritual. The egg placed whole over the embers, the pine cones selected with care, the grape seeds from fruit that was grown, pressed, drunk, and now offered back. These were not random items grabbed in haste. They were a considered vocabulary, a language of offering that the household gods were understood to read. The selection of species used for these offerings, pine cones, pine nuts, dried fruits, eggs, is consistent with findings in other ritual contexts and with depictions in Leraria frescoes, suggesting a degree of standardization in practices. Standardization. The same offerings, the same sequence, household after household across the city. Which means that on any given morning in Pompeii, while the bakers are loading the ovens and the women are walking to the fountains and the fullers are already treading cloth in their urine water, in dozens of kitchens and atria and back rooms across the city, small fires are being lit at small shrines, and the same words are being spoken, and the same items are being placed over the same embers. A city performing its relationship with the sacred in unison without coordination, because the coordination had been built into the culture so long ago that it no longer required instruction. Each day the master would call all the household, including slaves, to gather around the Lerarium, where prayer for protection and prosperity would be said with an offering for the Lares. Including slaves. This is not generosity. It is theology. The Lares protected the household as a unit. Every person living inside those walls, regardless of their legal status, fell under the same spiritual protection and therefore participated in the same ritual maintenance of it. The enslaved person standing at the Lerarium, speaking the words alongside the master who owned them, was both included in the household's sacred community and simultaneously reminded, by the very structure of the ritual, of the terms of that inclusion. It was the household god's version of the city's fundamental social arrangement, present together, unequal always. Step outside the domestic threshold, and the sacred does not stop. It follows you into the street. In any house, the religious nature of the inhabitants of Pompeii was clearly visible in the cult of the Lares, to whom an altar was also dedicated. Yet the tutelary deities of the house were originally the spirits of the ancestors, who in various paintings were often accompanied by the geniuses, the symbols of the procreating strength of the head of each family. But at the street corner, the Lares became communal. The compita, roadside shrines at the intersections of neighborhoods, were maintained not by one household, but by the quarter, the community of people who shared those streets and those fountains and those walls. These shrines marked the invisible boundaries between districts, each one presided over by the Lares Compitales, the crossroads guardians, tended by whoever lived nearby. Offerings were left here, too. A small bowl of oil, a garland of flowers, an incense stick burning in the morning air. The divine protection that began at the household Lerarium extended outward, to street by street, into a sacred geography that overlaid the city's physical one. You could walk Pompeii entirely by its shrines and never be more than a few meters from something consecrated. In Pompeii, Venus was worshipped as the creator of the universe, Venus Pompeiana, the protector of the city, and also Mother Nature, Venus Physica, the goddess of fertility and abundance. A temple was created in her honor on the promontory visible from the sea, and many images of her were displayed around the town. Venus was Pompeii's own goddess in a specific and civic sense, not just the Roman Venus, but Venus Pompeiana, identified with this particular city, its particular landscape, its particular commercial and agricultural abundance. The distinction mattered. It made the goddess local, invested, and personally interested in Pompeii's welfare in a way that a universal deity could not quite be. Venus Pompeiana did not divide her attention between 60 million Romans. She watched over this bay, these streets, this mountain. The oldest documented cults in Pompeii, dating back to the first half of the 6th century BC, were those dedicated to Apollo and Athena. 6 centuries before the eruption, this same ground was already sacred. People were already bringing offerings to Apollo here, already building sanctuary structures, already organizing their relationship with the divine around specific, named, geographically anchored powers. The Romans came later, absorbed what was there, renamed some of it, built temples in stone where there had been wooden enclosures, and continued. The Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, occupied the forum's northern end in official civic splendor. But beneath that official layer, the older dedications persisted, just as the Oscan street names persisted beneath the Latin, just as the older building foundations persisted beneath the Roman renovations. Pompeii was, religiously as architecturally, a palimpsest. Layer over layer over layer, none of them fully erased. Then there is the Temple of Isis, tucked into the theater district like a secret that everyone already knows. The Temple of Isis was located behind Pompeii's main theater, a strategic position that facilitated the blending of Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions. The location is not incidental. The theater and the mystery cult occupy the same neighborhood, both spaces where people went to experience something beyond the ordinary texture of daily life. In both spaces where the boundary between the self and something larger than the self was temporarily made permeable. Put them next to each other, and the city is saying something about what it understands those experiences to share. Principal devotees of this temple are assumed to be women, freedmen, and slaves. Initiates of the Isis mystery cult worshipped a compassionate goddess who promised eventual salvation and a perpetual relationship throughout life and after death. Read that list again. Women, freedmen, slaves. The three groups whose relationship with Roman official religion was most constrained. Women who could not hold state priesthoods in most cults, freedmen who carried the permanent social marking of their former status, enslaved people who had no legal personhood at all. Whereas the cult of Isis offered all three of them something the official Roman religious structure did not: direct access to a powerful divinity without the mediation of a civic hierarchy that excluded them. A personal relationship with a goddess who was explicitly the friend of the downtrodden. A promise of salvation, not the civic immortality of a man who built a forum or won a war, but individual, spiritual, available to anyone who underwent the rites. The temple also served as a place of liberation for slaves, who were often freed through fictitious sales to the goddess. This deserves a moment. A slave could be sold, fictitiously, ritually, legally, to Isis, become the property of the goddess, and the goddess, being divine and therefore above the ordinary mechanisms of ownership, could not hold them. The sale was a legal maneuver wrapped in sacred language. The slave became free, having been purchased by a deity who would not exercise the claim. The temple of a foreign goddess in the theater district of a companion city, functioning as a mechanism of liberation for enslaved people in a society that had no official interest in liberating them. For women specifically, participation in the cult of Isis provided an opportunity to engage with religion on a level similar to that of men, to enter the public sphere with a role as a priestess that they otherwise could not obtain in Roman state cults, and to earn salvation through a cleansing initiation into the cult. Women who had no voice in the forum had ritual authority in the Temple of Isis. The fresco from Herculaneum showing the ceremony of Isis depicts the high priest at the entrance. The sacred fire being tended, the worshippers arranged in rows, and most of those worshippers appear to be women. This was not accidental. The cult drew them because the cult took them seriously, offered them roles, gave their spiritual lives an institutional home in a city where their civic lives had none. Outside the city walls, on the road toward the Herculaneum Gate, stands the Villa of the Mysteries. It is a wealthy private residence built into the hillside, commanding a view of the bay, its rooms decorated with the kind of elaborateness that signals real money and real taste. But one room is different from the rest, a room whose walls carry, at near life size, one of the most studied and least fully understood paintings in the ancient world. The Dionysian frieze. A continuous narrative painted in the deep red that would come to be called, centuries later, Pompeian red. A sequence of figures that seem to be moving through a ritual, though the precise nature of the ritual has been argued about for as long as the fresco has been known. Secret initiation rites played an important role in the life of Pompeii's citizens, judging by the Villa of the Mysteries. The large villa contains an initiation chamber painted with a series of frescoes and was used for important rites of passage, often taking a dramatic form where initiates acted out death and rebirth. Death and rebirth. The ritual enactment of passing through death and returning changed. You went in one kind of person. You came out another. The mystery cult, Dionysian, Isiac, whatever form it took, offered an experience that the ordinary daily religious life of the household and the street could not. Transformation. Not just maintenance of the status quo through correct offering, but genuine alteration of the self through encounter with the divine. The figures in the frieze are painted with an intimacy unusual in Roman art. You can see the tension in a hand reaching forward, the particular quality of a face in the moment before something happens to it. A woman kneeling, her back turned to the viewer, her shoulders contracted in what might be fear or anticipation or both. A winged figure raising a staff. Dionysus himself leaning against his consort with the studied relaxation of a god who has all the time there is. The whole sequence moving from preparation through ordeal to resolution, to the viewer always slightly outside the innermost mystery, always watching through a veil that the paint is simultaneously drawing back and holding in place. We do not know precisely what happened in that room. We know the room was painted with enormous seriousness by painters of exceptional skill. For a patron who wanted this particular story on these particular walls permanently. We know it was a room where something was meant to occur that ordinary rooms were not equipped to hold. We know that whatever was enacted there, whatever form of death and rebirth was experienced, it was practiced in a house outside the city walls because it required a kind of privacy that the dense commercial city could not provide. The mystery needed space. The mystery needed walls that did not have 11,000 other things written on them. After the eruption, surviving citizens erected a temple to the Lares on the site of the Forum. It was thought that widespread neglect of the gods had caused the eruption of Vesuvius. Sit with that for a moment. The survivors, the people who got out, who were at Misenum or up the coast or inland when the mountain woke, looked back at what had happened to their city and reached for the only explanatory framework their world offered. The gods had been neglected. The offerings had been insufficient. The formulas had been said wrong, or not said at all, or said without proper feeling, or the feeling had been there, but the form had lapsed. Somewhere in the daily maintenance of the relationship between Pompeii and its divine protectors, something had been missed. The mountain was the consequence. They were not stupid. They were not primitive. They were people who had no geology, no seismology, no vocabulary for tectonic plate movement or pyroclastic flow or the behavior of magma chambers under pressure. They had theology. They had centuries of understanding that the world was animated by forces that required attention, that the sacred was not separate from the everyday, but woven through it, that the morning offering at the lararium and the egg over the embers and the words spoken in the correct order were not superstition, but maintenance, the daily upkeep of a relationship with the powers that govern survival. When survival failed, the explanation was the same as the explanation for everything else. The relationship had lapsed. The gods had turned their faces. The city had been so alive, so full of bread and wine and graffiti and dice games and frescoes and election notices and the perpetual noise of 20,000 people going about their days, that perhaps the smallness of the daily offering, the routine quality of the lararium fire, the slightly hurried pace of the morning prayer, had accumulated into something the gods experienced as neglect. Perhaps the city had been too busy living to attend properly to the forces that permitted it to live. Perhaps the mountain had simply been waiting for a reason, and silence was always, eventually, a reason. Beneath the city of Pompeii, below the basalt paving and the lead water pipes and the deep foundations of the Forum temples and the older Oscan walls beneath those, buried under everything the Romans built and everything that came before them, there is another city. Not a metaphor, an actual city. The ruins of a Bronze Age settlement buried in pumice and ash approximately 1,800 years before Pompeii was founded, destroyed by an eruption of Vesuvius so total that it buried the entire landscape of the Bay of Naples under meters of volcanic material. Huts, pots, livestock still in their enclosures, a population that apparently had enough warning to evacuate. Archaeologists find their footprints in the ash leading away, but not enough to return. The Avellino eruption, as it is now called, wiped a civilization from this ground and replaced it with a blank layer of pumice that future generations would eventually farm, build on, and inhabit without knowing what lay below. The Romans who built Pompeii did not know about the Avellino eruption. The evidence for it was 20 meters down, beneath the accumulation of 30-odd centuries. Recent excavations at the site of a new NATO base on the north of the bay revealed two catastrophic eruptions that preceded that of 79 AD, wiping out the populations of a densely occupied territory. But of this, the Romans knew nothing. They built on top of the silence left by a catastrophe they had no record of, no memory of, no mythology adequate to explain. They built, as all people build, on the assumption that the ground beneath them was simply ground. Stable, permanent, yes, the reliable foundation on which to press the weight of a city. The mountain that produced the Avellino eruption and the mountain that would produce the 79 AD eruption were the same mountain. It had simply been resting, 800 years approximately since its last significant activity before 79 AD. 8 centuries of quiet. 8 centuries of the mountain being nothing but a landform, green, fertile, enormous against the sky, its terraced vineyards descending toward the city in neat rows, its springs producing water that tasted of minerals and coldness. Villas and farms dotted its fertile slopes, and the region's rich soil was farmed extensively, becoming famous for its vineyards and the wine they produced. The mountain's silence had been so long, so uninterrupted, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of regional life, and that it had ceased to register as silence. It was simply the way things were. A mountain that grew good grapes, a mountain visible from almost every street in the city, a mountain that belonged to the landscape the way the sky belongs to the landscape, present, enormous, unquestioned. The Latin language had no word for volcano. The people of Pompeii didn't even have a word for a volcano, merely thinking it was a large mountain. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure of experience. You cannot develop vocabulary for a phenomenon you have never encountered. The Romans had fire, they had mountains, they had the forge of Vulcan, the divine smith, whose subterranean workshops were understood to account for various underground heat and gas phenomena throughout the Italian peninsula. They had Strabo, the geographer writing in the 1st century BC, who noted of Vesuvius that its summit showed signs of ancient burning, that the rock had the quality of volcanic residue, that something had once happened here that left a particular signature on the stone. Strabo was observant. Strabo was also writing description, not warning. He noted what he saw. He did not have the framework to understand what it meant. The irony is that the Romans were extremely interested in predicting the future. They were adept at observing portents in the shape of strange sights and sounds, unusual births, configurations of birds. Even in these terms, there were warnings of the eruption. Earthquakes themselves counted as portentous in the Roman religious framework. A significant tremor was a communication from Neptune, the earth shaker, or from some subterranean divine force registering displeasure. The priests and augurs whose job was to interpret such signs were not unaware that earthquakes required interpretation. They simply interpreted them theologically rather than geologically, because theology was the framework they had, and geology, as a discipline, did not yet exist. The gap between what the evidence was saying and what the observers could hear it saying was not a gap of stupidity. It was a gap of framework. The signals were real. The instruments for reading them simply had not been invented yet. In 62 AD, the framework was tested severely. A major earthquake caused widespread destruction around the Bay of Naples, particularly to Pompeii. Buildings collapsed, sections of the aqueduct failed. The Temple of Jupiter at the northern end of the Forum was so damaged it was still under reconstruction 17 years later, in 79 AD, when the mountain finally woke. The earthquake was large enough, estimates suggest it registered around magnitude 7.5, that it was felt across the region, recorded by historians, noticed by Emperor Nero, who happened to be performing in Naples at the time, and, according to Suetonius, continued singing through the tremors until he had finished his song before evacuating the theater, which is either remarkable composure or a performer's refusal to acknowledge a bad review from the universe. The earthquake of 62 AD was, geologists now understand, almost certainly a precursor event. The same volcanic system stirring and the same magma chamber that would eventually produce the 79 AD eruption already building pressure, expressing that pressure through seismic activity. The 62 earthquake should have been a warning that Vesuvius was dangerously active. Seismic activity had been ongoing for years, and the earthquake was the first major sign that something would happen. However, the Romans did not realize the connection between small quakes and volcanic activity, and the eruption took everyone by surprise. After the earthquake, something interesting happened socially. Many wealthy Romans who had used Pompeii as a vacation spot and purchased second homes as getaways did not return after the earthquake of 62 AD. By the time of the eruption, there were a substantial number of abandoned vacation homes, where the wealthy had resources and mobility that ordinary residents did not. They could choose not to return. They could decide that a city mid-reconstruction, still trembling occasionally, was not the retreat they required. And so some of them left, not because they understood the geological situation, but because the inconvenience exceeded the appeal. The people who stayed were the people whose lives were there: the baker, the fuller, the bar owner, the freed slave who had built a business. You do not leave the place that is your entire world simply because the ground shook. The 17 years between the earthquake and the eruption were years of rebuilding, and they were years of the ground continuing to speak, quietly, intermittently, in the only language it had. The first subtle hints of Vesuvius's awakening were the minor tremors felt in and around Pompeii. Unlike the devastating earthquake of 62 AD, these tremors were less severe and more sporadic, easily dismissed as inconsequential by a population accustomed to occasional seismic activity. What the residents failed to recognize was that these tremors were not mere aftershocks, but precursors to a much larger volcanic event. And the wells, sources of water, crucial for daily life and agriculture, mysteriously dried up. Wells and springs that had provided water for generations suddenly became barren, an anomaly that puzzled the locals. Groundwater displaced by rising magma, the water table shifting as the mountain's interior changed shape. The springs that had been feeding the region's farms for generations simply stopped. But the wells drew nothing. People dug deeper, found nothing. The water that had always been there was gone, for reasons that had no explanation available to anyone in Pompeii in August of 79 AD. It was strange. It was noted. It was absorbed, as all strange things are eventually absorbed into the ordinary texture of a city that had too many problems. The reconstruction, the commerce, the elections, the bread, the daily operation of 20,000 lives, to hold any single strangeness at full attention for very long. About 600 sheep died in Pompeii due to polluted air in the period before the eruption. 600 animals, dead without obvious cause. The air carrying something the animals sensed before the humans did. Volcanic gases, sulfurous emissions, the slow chemical signature of a mountain beginning to move. The animals had no theology. They had no framework for interpreting the dying wells and the shaking ground and the air that tasted wrong. They simply died, which was the most honest response available to them. Minor earthquakes were reported in the 4 days before the eruption, but the warnings were not recognized. The inhabitants of the area surrounding Vesuvius had been accustomed to minor tremors. Pliny the Younger wrote that they were not particularly alarming because they are frequent in Campania. Not particularly alarming. Frequent in Campania. This is the sentence that carries the whole weight of what is about to happen, not ignorance, familiarity. The tremors were familiar. The ground had been shaking occasionally and without consequence for as long as anyone in Pompeii could remember. For their parents' lifetimes and their grandparents' lifetimes, the ground had shaken and then stopped shaking, and then the city had continued. The evidence of this was everywhere. The city still stood. Every previous tremor had ended. Every previous morning had been followed by another morning. The pattern was not ambiguous. The pattern was entirely consistent with the ground shaking and then stopping. The pattern was about to be broken for the first time in 8 centuries in a city that had existed for perhaps 5 of those centuries, which meant no one alive had any experience, ancestral or recorded, of the pattern failing. There is a thought that keeps arriving when you look at this sequence long enough. We are not different from the people of Pompeii in the ways that matter here. We live on assumptions about continuity that are built from pattern recognition. This has always happened this way, therefore, it will keep happening this way. We are exquisitely sensitive to sudden dramatic change and catastrophically insensitive to slow, incremental change whose final expression is discontinuous. The wells dry slowly. The tremors are familiar. The sheep die, and it is strange but not impossible to absorb. And then one day, the column rises 30 kilometers into the stratosphere, and the pattern ends all at once in a way that makes the previous normalcy impossible to recover. We have better science now. We have seismographs on Vesuvius and volcanologists who monitor the pressure in the magma chamber and evacuation plans for the 3 million people who currently live in the mountain shadow. We are not ignorant of the connection between seismic activity and volcanic eruption. We know precisely what the dried wells meant, what the dead sheep meant, what the 4 days of increasing tremors meant. Whether knowing changes the behavior, whether the pattern recognition that normalizes the incremental can be overridden by the knowledge that normalization is a kind of blindness, is a question the people of Pompeii could not ask because they did not have the framework. It is a question we can ask. Whether we ask it is a different matter. On the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, Pompeii woke up as it always woke up. The ovens were loaded before dawn. The fountains moved their perpetual water through the lead pipes and into the stone basins. The shutters on the Via dell'Abbondanza came down in their grooves. The offering at the Lararium was made, the words spoken in the correct order, the small fire lit and tended and allowed to consume its pine cones and its dried figs and its whole egg. Somewhere on a wall near the theater, the self-referential joke about walls and tedious writing was still legible in the morning light, as it had been legible every morning since someone scratched it there with a nail and walked away satisfied. The mountain was visible from the northern streets as it was always visible. Green, still. Its terraced vineyards descending in familiar geometry. Its summit, a clean line against the August sky. A sky that was, on this particular morning, unusually clear, the light having that specific quality of Mediterranean late summer clarity that makes every surface sharp and the shadows precise and the world look briefly. Would like it has been rendered at higher resolution than usual. The mountain had always been there. It would always be there. Around noon, the sky above the summit changed. The morning was normal. This is the first thing Pliny the Younger establishes. In the letter he wrote to the historian Tacitus, 25 years after he watched the mountain wake from across the bay. He was 17 years old. He was staying at Misenum with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, the great naturalist, the man who would sail toward the eruption rather than away from it and die on the beach at Stabiae trying to help. On the morning of what would become one of the most documented days in the ancient world, Pliny the Younger was doing what 17-year-olds do when they are staying with a distinguished and demanding relative. He was studying. His uncle had taken a sunbath, then a cold bath, then reclined after a light lunch with his books. The bay was visible from the house at Misenum. The sky over the water was clear. 29 kilometers across that water, Pompeii was opening its shutters. This is what the record insists on, again and again, in the specific way that survivors always insist on it. The morning was ordinary. The bread was out of the oven. The fountains were running. The children were going to school. The stew at Asalina's counter was warming in its jars. Whatever was going to happen had not yet announced itself. The city had been given, in the inscrutable arithmetic of catastrophe, one last full morning of not knowing. Around noon, someone pointed at the sky. Pliny the Younger records that his mother drew his uncle's attention to a cloud of unusual size and shape. It rose from the direction of the mountain, though, from Misenum, it was not immediately clear which mountain. With an appearance Pliny the Elder would later describe in the letter his nephew preserved. A pine tree. The cloud rose on what appeared to be a tall trunk, then spread at the top into branches, wide and flat, a canopy of ash and gas and rock punching 30 kilometers into the stratosphere. The Plinian column, as volcanologists would name it nearly 2,000 years later in his honor, was carrying approximately 1.5 million tons of volcanic material into the atmosphere every second. The eruption had likely begun an hour before anyone at Misenum noticed the cloud. Researchers now believe the eruption began around noon, an hour before Pliny the Younger observed the umbrella-like cloud looming over the mountain around 1 p.m., which means that while Pliny's uncle was finishing his lunch and reaching for his books, the mountain had already started. The column was already building. The pumice was already in the air above Vesuvius, beginning its slow arc southward toward the city. In Pompeii, the sky changed color first. The light acquired a quality no one had seen before. Not the ordinary dimming of cloud cover, but something specific and wrong. The particular yellow-gray of an atmosphere full of particles that have no business being there. The pumice arrived next, not fire, not lava. Pumice, porous volcanic stone, gray and lightweight, and had the texture of frozen smoke, falling from the sky the way hail falls, but stranger because it was warm, and because it didn't melt, and because it kept coming, accumulating in the streets and on the rooftops, and in the folds of clothing and against the doorways with the patient, inexorable logic of something that had all the time it needed. The first hours were survivable. This is the most important and most agonizing fact about the eruption of Vesuvius. For the first several hours, through the afternoon and into the early evening, Pompeii was not dying. It was suffering, disoriented, increasingly burdened by ash, increasingly dark. But it was not yet beyond the capacity of human decision to escape. The column above the mountain was catastrophic in geological terms. On the ground in Pompeii, it was strange and frightening and almost certainly unprecedented in anyone's experience. But you could still walk out of it. The roads were passable, if difficult. The gates were open. Some people left. They gathered what they could carry: valuables, food, children, the elderly. And they moved. They tied cushions to their heads with cloth, holding them in place against the falling pumice. Pliny the Younger describes people doing exactly this in his account of the evacuation. The image is both practical and strange. The Romans of Pompeii, improvising armor against a sky that had turned against them, walking out through the gates of their city with pillows on their heads. Practical, adaptive, and, in the way that improvised responses to impossible situations always are, somehow dignified. The people who stayed had reasons, and some did not believe the danger was terminal. The ground had shaken before. Strange things had happened before. The city had always continued. Some were too old, too ill, too encumbered to travel in falling ash. Some were waiting for family members who did not come. Some were protecting property they could not bring themselves to abandon. The plaster casts show parents clutching children, wealthy citizens who delayed evacuation too long, still clutching their most valuable possessions. The key in the hand. The man who was locking something when the darkness found him, trying to secure what he owned in the moment before he understood that ownership was no longer the relevant question. The pumice accumulated. By late afternoon, each 2.5 meters of it lay over the streets of Pompeii, deep enough that the step thresholds of the tabernae were submerged, that the fountain basins were buried, that the carefully placed stepping stones at intersections had disappeared under a gray layer that made the whole city look like a world seen through dirty glass. The roofs began to give way. Stone and tile structures held better than the wooden roof spaces. In those rooms, the pumice piled up through the evening. In the rooms beneath the wooden roofs, the ceilings cracked and descended, and the people sheltering beneath them had to decide again whether staying was still a reasonable choice. Some of them still chose to stay, or could not choose otherwise. At 7 in the evening, the eruption changed. At 7:06 p.m., researchers estimate, thus the eruption changed character, initiating the first scalding pyroclastic currents, often considered the most hazardous of any volcanic event. These currents continued overnight, occurring approximately 80 minutes apart. A pyroclastic current is not lava. It is not slow. It does not move in the way that visible liquid rock moves, steadily, avoidably, in a direction you can calculate and exit. A pyroclastic current is a density avalanche, superheated gas mixed with rock fragments and volcanic debris, moving at 300 to 600 kilometers per hour, with temperatures ranging from 200 to 700 degrees Celsius. It does not flow around obstacles. It goes over them, through them, past them. The time between your first awareness of a pyroclastic current and its arrival is, depending on how far away the mountain is, somewhere between insufficient and 0. Pompeii was 5 kilometers from Vesuvius's crater. At the speed these currents moved, 5 kilometers took approximately 60 seconds. The first currents of the evening were smaller. They reached the walls of the city, but did not penetrate deeply. They killed people caught in the open outside the walls. Inside the city, those who had survived the pumice fall were still sheltering, still waiting, still making the calculation that remaining was safer than moving. The darkness was total by now. Not the darkness of night, which has its own gradations, but the complete obliteration of light that comes when the atmosphere above you is so dense with volcanic material that no photons are reaching the ground. Pliny the Younger, across the bay at Misenum, described this darkness as more absolute than any night he had experienced. Broad flames shone out in several places from Mount Vesuvius, which the darkness of the night contributed to render still brighter and clearer. He was watching fire visible from 30 kilometers away. The people beneath it could not see their hands in front of their faces. Somewhere in that darkness, Pliny the Elder was dying. He had sailed toward the eruption at first sight of the column, partly out of scientific curiosity, partly because a friend named Rectina had sent him a desperate message from her villa at the foot of the mountain asking for rescue. He commanded the Roman fleet at Misenum. He had ships, he sailed. By the time he reached the shore at Stabiae, the wind was against him, and he could not leave. He ate dinner with the local magistrate and Pomponianus. He slept, or gave the appearance of sleeping. His enormous frame produced snores audible in the courtyard. The courtyard outside was filling with pumice. By dawn, the pumice was deep enough that if he stayed longer, he would not be able to exit the house. He went outside. He sat down on a sailcloth laid on the ground. He asked for cold water. He drank it. He stood up and immediately fell. His companions fled. When they returned after the darkness lifted, he was lying where he had fallen, his body intact, his appearance, as Pliny the Younger carefully records, more like a sleeping man than a dead one, poisoned by the volcanic gases. The greatest natural scientist of the Roman world, felled by a phenomenon he had sailed toward because he wanted to see it more clearly. He saw it more clearly than anyone. He did not survive seeing it. At some point in the night, a lull. As the sun began to rise on the second day of the eruption, the ashfall on Pompeii began to ease. Citizens within the city limits believed it was all over, and some of those who had fled even began to return to their homes to gather what was left of their possessions. This detail is almost impossible to sit with. People came back, having survived the night, having made it through the ash and the darkness and the falling pumice and the smaller pyroclastic currents. They returned to the city in the gray early morning calm to gather their things, hoping the worst had passed, reasoning, as you would reason, that the pattern of dangerous events resolving was the pattern that would hold here too. The mountain had been catastrophic and now seemed quieter. The city was buried, but the city was still there. You could walk back in. You could find your house under the pumice and dig toward the door and look for what mattered. They were walking back in on the morning of August 25th. The disaster peaked at daybreak the following day when the eruptive column collapsed. During a brief lull, residents tried to flee the doomed city. Then, suddenly, at 7:07 a.m., the deadliest pyroclastic current struck. A particularly thick and fast-moving concoction of hot gas and rock fragments. 7:07 in the morning. The column above the mountain had been building pressure that no column could sustain indefinitely, and at 7:07 it gave way. The structural collapse of a Plinian column releases everything held aloft: the gas, the rock, the debris, and the superheated material suspended 30 kilometers in the air, and sends it laterally outward in all directions as a ground-hugging surge of heat and velocity that eliminates the vertical option entirely. You cannot outrun it. You cannot shelter from it. There is no door thick enough, no room deep enough, no distance reachable in the seconds between its departure from the mountain slope and its arrival at the city's walls. This current roared for 9 hours, spreading scalding debris 25 kilometers across the plain. Approximately half of Pompeii's victims were found in the streets entombed in this volcanic layer. Half. The people walking back in to retrieve their things. The people who had sheltered through the night in the strongest rooms and emerged at dawn into the quiet. The people who had never left, who had chosen or been unable to choose, and had survived 18 hours of eruption only to be found by the thing that ended it. The temperature at the ground level in Pompeii during the surge has been estimated at somewhere between 200 and 300 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the human body does not burn slowly. The soft tissues vaporize. What remains is the shape, the outline of a person pressed into the cooling ash as the surge passed, as the temperature dropped, as the material hardened around what had been a body and is now only a form. A hollow in the ash in the exact dimensions of a human life. Giuseppe Fiorelli, excavating in the 1860s, poured plaster into these hollows, and found the people still inside them. The woman with her wrists raised to protect her face. The man on his side with his hand curled beneath his cheek. The child, the dog, the family group, 4 of them, found together in a room they had believed was safe enough to wait in. They are in the Naples Archaeological Museum. You can visit, you can stand in front of them and understand, in a way that no written description quite accomplishes, what it means to say that Pompeii ended mid-sentence. By 8 in the morning on August 25th, the city was gone. Not damaged, not wounded, not in the ambiguous condition of a place that has survived a catastrophe and must now decide how to rebuild. Gone. Buried under 4 to 6 meters of ash, pumice, and pyroclastic deposit. The streets submerged, the fountains buried, the Via dell'Abbondanza invisible. And the election notices that had been fresh enough 2 days ago that the paint was still slightly tacky. Gone. The graffiti on the walls, gone, sealed, preserved in darkness. The 81 loaves in Modestus's oven. The dice boards scratched into the stone benches outside the taverns. The groove in the fountain basin worn by generations of clay jars. All of it there, all of it sealed. Around 4 p.m. on August the 25th, as the fracturing volcano interacted with groundwater, it increased its explosiveness and generated finer pyroclastic currents. These flows do not contain human remains, suggesting that few of Pompeii's residents, if any, were alive after the morning's devastation. At 8:05 p.m., the eruption finally ceased. The mountain stopped. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a landscape that has been rearranged. Not the silence of a place resting, but the silence of a place that no longer knows what it is. The Bay of Naples was visible from where Pliny the Younger stood at Messinum. He described a dark cloud that had been chasing him along the beach, hugging the ground, moving with the specific deliberateness of something that had not yet decided it was done. He outran it. Most of the people in Pompeii did not have his head start or his direction. He was 17. He lived to write it down. The city he was looking at across the water, the city he could not see because the darkness was too complete, had stopped existing as a city at 7:07 that morning. It existed now only as a shape beneath the ash, an outline, a hollow in the material world, waiting for someone to arrive, centuries later, with a lamp and a trowel and eventually a tube of plaster to find out what the shape had been. They found bread. They found stew, still in the pots. They found a joke about walls. 1,700 years passed, not metaphorically, literally in the dark, beneath 4 to 6 meters of compacted volcanic material with no air and almost no moisture, and therefore almost no decay. While the Roman Empire reached its peak and began its long recession, while the Western Empire fell and the Eastern one persisted, while the Middle Ages arrived and arranged themselves into centuries and departed, while the plague came and left and came again. While the Renaissance found its footing and the printing press was invented and the New World was contacted and the Old Worlds reorganized themselves into arrangements that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had walked the Via dell'Abbondanza on the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. Through all of it, the bread sat in the oven. The stew held its residue in the dolia. The graffiti stayed on the walls. The groove in the fountain basin, worn smooth by generations of clay jars, waited in the dark. The lararium in the house of the Vetii kept its dancing lares, still mid-gesture, still holding their libation vessels, still presiding over a household that no longer existed in any form except the shape of its rooms and the color on its walls. The plaster casts had not yet been made. The bodies were still bodies, slowly becoming cavities in the hardening ash, the negative space of people who had been alive and were no longer waiting in the dark for someone to arrive with a lamp and an idea. Nobody came for 1,700 years. And then, in 1748, somebody did. The rediscovery of Pompeii was not dramatic. It was accidental. Workers excavating foundations for a summer palace commissioned by the King of Naples struck the top of a buried wall, then another wall, then a floor with a mosaic. They had found Herculaneum first, in 1738. Pompeii would follow 10 years later, when the same kind of excavation work broke through the ceiling of the same kind of silence. The first systematic digs were not careful by modern standards. They were treasure hunts. Workers moved through the buried city looking for objects of value. Frescoes cut from walls, statues levered from pedestals, bronze work carried out and cleaned and deposited in royal collections. The context of the objects, where exactly they were found, what was near them, what the room they came from looked like as a whole, was recorded poorly or not at all. Even the tomb raiders understood eventually that what Pompeii contained was worth something. When illegal tunnel excavations were discovered at the Civita Juliana villa just outside the city walls, dug along the walls in search of frescoes or anything valuable that could be sold on the antiquities market, archaeologists took over the tunnels and followed them into a space that yielded a processional chariot, the remains of horses still in their harnesses, and eventually the plaster casts of two men, a rich man and his slave, so found together in a room where they had taken shelter, killed together by the second surge on the morning of August 25th. The thieves had been looking for portable objects. What was actually there was something the market had no price for. The man who changed Pompeii was Giuseppe Fiorelli. He arrived as director of excavations in 1860, a former student of numismatics and archaeology who had been imprisoned for 2 years for his political views before the unification of Italy gave him his position. He came to Pompeii with the instincts of a scientist rather than a treasure hunter. Where his predecessors had moved through the ruins looking for what they could extract, Fiorelli was interested in the ruins themselves, in the city as a system, in the relationship between objects and the context they were found in, like in what the ash could tell you if you paid it the right kind of attention. He divided the city into a grid. He numbered the blocks, the houses, the individual doorways. He published excavation reports, systematic and detailed, creating a record of the dig that could be studied by people who were not present for it. He opened the excavations to the public, which is why Pompeii became a site that millions of people eventually visited rather than a private treasure trove supplying royal collections. These were significant methodological contributions. But the thing Fiorelli is remembered for, the thing that changed what Pompeii could say to the world, was the plaster. He noticed the voids, hollow spaces in the hardened ash, irregular in shape, roughly body-sized, clearly the impression of something organic that had been there and decayed away over the centuries while the ash hardened around its outline. Previous excavators had found these voids and ignored them or broken through them in the search for more obviously valuable material beneath. Fiorelli looked at a void and saw what it was: the last record of a person. The exact shape of a human body at the exact moment of death, preserved in the medium that had killed it. He poured liquid plaster in. He waited for it to set. He chipped away the surrounding ash, and there was a person, or rather, the form of a person, in every detail that mattered: the posture, the expression, the position of the hands, the fabric of the clothing pressed against the skin. The technique has since been refined. The CAT scans now sweep through Fiorelli's original thick plaster casts, drawing a clearer picture of the victims, revealing bone structure, personal effects, even dental health. Laser scanning has confirmed, among other findings, that Pompeians had remarkably good teeth, consistent with a fiber-rich, low-sugar diet. The man who had been preserved as a shape in ash for nearly 18 centuries turned out, on scanning, to have excellent molars. These are not trivial findings. They are the accumulated portrait of a population, their diet, their health, their physical labor, their age at death, their relationship to the diseases and nutritional deficiencies that left marks on bone. The plaster gave us the outside. The scanner gives us the inside. Between the two, a person who walked the Via dell'Abbondanza in 79 AD becomes reconstructible in a way that no other population from the ancient world can be reconstructed. We do not just know that Romans lived here. We know how they lived at a level of physical specificity that the written record alone could never provide. The excavation is not finished. Approximately 1/3 of the city remains unexcavated, sealed, still in the dark, still holding whatever it holds. The decision to leave it unexcavated is deliberate. The technology available to future archaeologists will be better than anything available today, the way today's tools are better than Fiorelli's plaster and infinitely better than the treasure hunters who came before him. What is left sealed is left as a gift to the future, the knowledge that there is still more. That the city has not yet said everything it has to say. What has been excavated continues to produce revelations at a pace that suggests the sealed third may contain things that would rewrite whole chapters of what we think we know. In 2024, archaeologists discovered a construction site that appears to have been active when Vesuvius erupted, still containing construction tools, offering insight into the same engineering practices that gave rise to the Colosseum and the Pantheon. A building mid-construction, its scaffolding still implied by the evidence, its workers apparently having set down their tools to look at the sky and never return to pick them up. The Pantheon of Rome, the building that has arguably influenced more architecture than any other structure in Western history, was being built using the same techniques, to the same tools, the same knowledge that a Pompeian construction crew was applying on the morning of August 24, 79 AD. History in the abstract, a trowel in the specific. In November 2020, the remains of two men thought to be a rich man and his slave were found in a thick layer of ash. They appeared to have escaped the first eruption but were killed by a second blast the next day. A study of the bones showed that the younger man had done heavy manual labor throughout his life. They were found together in a room, having made the same choice, having survived the first night, having been found by the same surge on the same morning. The legal and social distance between them, the infinite gulf that Roman law placed between a free man and his property, collapsed entirely in the ash. They lay together for nearly 2,000 years. They were found together. The mountain, as Block 3 noted, did not distinguish. There is an ethical question that archaeologists have been asking themselves with increasing seriousness, and it deserves a moment here. In the 21st century, experts initiated conversations on the ethical implications of displaying human remains. Many researchers argued that the museological display of the casts was disrespectful to the deceased, that the voyeuristic element of witnessing them was overpowering their educational value. The plaster bodies in the Naples Archaeological Museum, the woman with her wrists raised, the family group, the child, are displayed to millions of visitors a year. They are photographed. They appear in travel blogs and history documentaries and school textbooks. They have become, in a way that nobody planned and nobody can easily undo, icons. The most reproduced images in the entire visual vocabulary of ancient Rome are not the frescoes or the mosaics or the architecture. They are the shapes of dead people. This is worth sitting with rather than quickly resolving. The people who became those shapes did not consent to becoming them. They were not preparing for posterity. They were trying to find a room safe enough to shelter in, and they were found there, and their finding became one of the most powerful archaeological records in human history. That record has value, enormous, irreplaceable, humanizing value that no other evidence could provide. It also belongs to people who are, in every meaningful sense, people, not artifacts, not data. The tension between those two facts does not resolve cleanly. It just exists, the way most of the important tensions in human life exist, present, unresolved, requiring ongoing acknowledgement rather than final answer. Now consider what would be known of Pompeii without the ash. Remove the volcanic deposit. Allow the city to decay at the ordinary pace of a city abandoned, stone robbed for building material, metal melted down and reused, wood rotted within decades, plaster fallen from walls within a generation, mosaics broken up and scattered, organic material gone almost immediately. What would remain after 1,700 years of ordinary decay is what remains of nearly every other ancient city. The stone foundations, some durable objects, coins, the occasional inscription carved deep into durable material. We would know that Pompeii existed. We would know its approximate size. We might have a few names from the inscriptions, a few objects in museum collections purchased from dealers who purchased them from someone who found them somewhere in a field in Campania. We would not know about the bread. We would not know about the stew. We would not know what Successus wrote to Iris on the wall near her bar, or what his rival wrote beneath it, or what the city thought about gladiators, or that a child learning arithmetic pressed numbers into a wall with a stylus and left the evidence of their lesson to outlast every empire that has existed since. We would not know that someone stood in a Roman street in the 1st century AD, looked at the accumulated writing around them, and made a dry joke about walls. We would not have the shapes, the hollow left by the woman with her wrists raised, the family group, the dog, lying still at its post. What the ash took, it also kept. The same force that ended the city became the condition of its survival. The catastrophe was also the preservation. This is the strange, almost unbearable irony at the center of everything Pompeii has given us, that we know these people, that they are as close to us as any ancient population has ever been, that their bread and their graffiti and their election notices and their household gods and their dice boards and their plaster shapes feel proximate and real and almost touchable, because the mountain killed them. The mountain killed them, and in killing them, held them, and in holding them, gave them back to us in a form that living and aging and ordinary decay could never have provided. So what is Pompeii, finally? It is not a monument to disaster. It is not a cautionary tale about the dangers of building near volcanoes, though it is that too, functionally. It is not primarily a window into the lives of emperors and senators and the official machinery of the Roman Empire, though the empire is visible everywhere in its streets and its structures. It is something rarer and harder to name, a city that happened to be preserved at the exact moment of its fullest life, mid-sentence, mid-morning, with the bread in the oven and the stew in the pots, and the graffiti still legible, and the groove in the fountain basin still shaped by the weight of 10,000 ordinary mornings. It is proof that ordinary life is worth remembering. Not the official version of life, not the emperors and the battles and the dates of treaties, but the actual texture of being alive in a body in a city with other people, buying bread from a counter, arguing about gladiators on a wall, falling in love with someone who doesn't notice, telling a joke about walls, and then walking away into the rest of your afternoon. The texture that history almost never preserves because it is too common, too daily, too lacking in the drama that seems to justify preservation. Pompeii preserved it anyway, accidentally, catastrophically, completely. And what that preservation tells us, what all of it, the bread and the graffiti and the plaster shapes and the groove in the fountain and the 81 loaves in the oven of Modestus's bakery, what all of it tells us together is something very simple. Now, something so simple that it might seem too small for everything that has led to it. The people of Pompeii were people, not ancient Romans in the abstract, not toga-clad figures in a textbook illustration, not tragic victims of a famous disaster. People, with morning routines and love lives and political opinions and a fondness for jokes. With household gods they spoke to before breakfast and dice boards they scratched into stone benches and bars they went to in the afternoon, and children they watched learn to read. With the same feeling you have had on any given Tuesday that the day was ordinary, and the next day would follow it, and the world was fundamentally going to continue. They had the mountain, and they didn't know what the mountain was. You have your own version of that. Everybody does. The thing that is right there, enormous, present in every view, whose nature you have not yet found a vocabulary for. The bread was warm. The day had begun. The city was alive in every room, and on every wall, and in every grooved stone threshold, and every scored loaf and every word scratched into plaster by someone who needed the thought to exist somewhere outside their own head. And then the sky changed color, and the pumice fell, and the city became what it is now, which is, impossibly, more than it was then, more documented, more known, more present to the people who never walked its streets than it was to most of the people who did. The walls held, the bread is in the museum, Turtulla is still being talked about. Sleep now, the city is quiet, the mountain is still, the ash has done its work and kept its gift in the morning, that last ordinary morning. And the bread just out of the oven, the fountains running, the shutters sliding back in their grooves. That morning is not lost. It is here. It has always been here.